In the freezing grip of the Rocky Mountains, one man's quest for survival led to an innovation that would forever change the way mountain men built their cabins. With winter winds howling and snow piling high, Samuel Burke's ash mud wall not only shielded him from the elements, but made his cabin nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than any other in the area. But what began as a solution to a personal crisis soon sparked a revolution in frontier construction. Before we dive into this incredible survival story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories of wilderness ingenuity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The next chapter will leave you stunned. The mountain wind howled, clawing at Samuel Burke's cabin, a shrill reminder of how unforgiving nature could be. Nestled high in the Rockies, Samuel's small log cabin stood sturdy but under siege from the elements. He had built it himself, as most mountain men did, but with the first real test of winter, he soon realized that his simple shelter was no match for the fierce cold that enveloped the land. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled weakly in the hearth, struggling to keep the frost at bay. Samuel, bundled in a heavy wool coat and fur-lined boots, sat with his hands cupped around a steaming mug of hot tea. His face, weathered from years of exposure, bore the kind of intensity only the harshest environments could create. His beard, thick and braided, kept the chill from biting into his skin, but the cold seeped into the walls, through the cracks, and into his bones. He had spent the last several weeks preparing for winter. The supplies had been stacked high in the corner: pelts, dried meats, and barrels of salted fish. Yet none of it seemed to matter when faced with the bone-deep cold that had become a constant companion since the first frost. The fire, which should have been enough, was insufficient for the kind of cold that seemed to penetrate the very earth beneath him. That night, as the wind picked up, he began to reflect on the months leading to this moment. This wasn't his first winter in the mountains, but it was his first winter alone. He had lost his partner, James, to a bear attack in the spring. It had been a violent death, the kind that Samuel still replayed in his mind. The loss haunted him every day, but it also fueled his determination to survive. He was no stranger to hardship, but he would not let the elements or wildlife claim his life, too. Not while he had his wits, and not while he still had the ability to innovate. Looking around his cabin, he saw only the basic construction: the notched logs, the simple hearth, the thick walls made of what little timber the area provided. There was no sophistication to it, and more importantly, no real defense against the cold. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. If he couldn't keep the cold out, he might not survive the winter. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. As the fire flickered, Samuel thought of how he could make his shelter more than just a place to sleep. What if he could build something that could not only protect him from the cold, but keep his energy and warmth in when the mountain's fierce winds came? His hands shook as the teacup slipped from his grip. He suddenly stood up, pacing in front of the fire, a plan beginning to form in his mind. The ashes from the fire were always piling up. Perhaps they could help. What if he could mix them with something else? Mud? Clay? His mind raced, piecing together his thoughts, merging the practicality of frontier survival with something new. The fire crackled in agreement, and with that crackle, a new mission was born. The days that followed were filled with intense focus. Samuel had always been a practical man, but now necessity had forced him into the role of an inventor. He began experimenting with the materials he had at hand: wood, stone, ash, and mud. His first thought was simple: the wall needed something to insulate it, something to make it impenetrable to the freezing winds. That's when he remembered the ash from his fire. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed the way the ash settled thickly around the hearth, creating a warm, protective layer. What if, instead of simply discarding it, he could use it? Ash was a natural insulator, and he knew that the earth in this part of the mountains was rich in clay. He had seen the way the soil became malleable after a good rain, but the trick would be mixing it just right, strong enough to hold, but pliable enough to mold. Over the next few days, Samuel set to work. The first step was to clear space inside the cabin. He had already gathered stones and logs, which formed the foundation of his walls. Now he would create something entirely new, a layer of ash mud that could be applied directly to the walls. He gathered large quantities of ash from his fire and mixed it with the mud from the creek bed. The combination was thick and nearly unworkable, but Samuel was no stranger to tough tasks. The wall began to take shape, layer by layer. At first, he applied the mud directly to the logs, creating a thin barrier. The ash was then worked in as a mixture, giving it a weight and density that was unlike anything he had ever seen before. As he worked, he could feel the difference in the air. The cabin, which had always felt cold and drafty, now had a layer of warmth that began to settle in the corners. Each layer of ash and mud became stronger as it dried. The cabin walls, once easily breached by the wind, were now impenetrable. By the end of the second week, Samuel could see the difference. The temperature inside the cabin was already 15 degrees warmer, and he hadn't even finished the final coat. But he knew he wasn't done. The cold, as harsh as it was, would not be so easily beaten. Samuel's innovation had taken root, but he had yet to discover just how powerful this new construction method would be. For now, the results were enough. The warmth inside the cabin was real, and as the first snows of winter began to blanket the ground outside, Samuel knew he had made a step toward the safety he so desperately needed. The mountain had always been merciless, but now Samuel had a chance to survive it, and that chance was worth everything. The days following the completion of his new ash mud wall were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but Samuel knew that his work wasn't over. The cold, unpredictable mountain winds would not stop simply because he had built a warmer cabin. Nature, he had learned over the years, didn't care about human ingenuity. It only cared about survival. The true test of his method would come when the worst of winter's fury arrived. One morning, as the sun was still hidden behind the mountain peaks, the wind began to howl. Samuel woke to the familiar sound, but this time it was different. There was an edge to it, a biting cold that slipped through the cracks in his cabin's door despite the new seal. He knew it was time to test the strength of his creation. The ash mud wall had worked for the last few days, but the real test was a long, brutal storm. If his cabin was going to stand against the elements, it needed to endure the kind of storm that could freeze a man's bones within hours. Samuel got up from his bed, his breath visible in the frigid air. He pulled on his thick wool trousers and fur-lined boots, the ones he had worn for years during the harshest conditions. His fur coat hung over a nearby peg, but he had already decided it wasn't going to help him this time. He needed something more, something that could ensure his survival. He stepped outside and surveyed the horizon. The sky had turned a dull, threatening gray, and the wind kicked up, carrying snow with it. The visibility was nearly zero, and the temperature was dropping faster than he had expected. He knew from experience that the storm would last for days. That would be plenty of time to determine if his walls could withstand this kind of freeze. Inside the cabin, he stoked the fire, building it high and hot. He didn't want to take any chances. The ashes, now a key part of his wall's insulation, were burning fiercely in the hearth, sending a comforting warmth throughout the room. Samuel sat near the fire, watching as the storm raged outside. His walls, solid and reinforced, held steady. Not a draft seeped through the new layer of ash mud. As the hours passed, the storm grew stronger, but inside Samuel's cabin, the warmth was almost tangible. The heat from the fire, which once seemed to dissipate into the air, now radiated, bouncing off the ash mud barrier he had so painstakingly created. The temperature inside the cabin held steady, staying a full 20 degrees warmer than it had been just days before. It was a success. But Samuel wasn't content. He had known from the beginning that this was only the beginning. The wall had passed the first test, but he needed more proof. He needed to know it would work under the most extreme conditions, with snow and ice building up against the walls for days. The next test would come when the storm subsided. If his cabin could stay warm through the freeze, Samuel knew he had something that could change the way men built their shelters in the mountains. 3 days had passed since the storm began, and Samuel had remained holed up in his cabin, checking the wall and the temperature with every passing hour. The storm had pushed him to the edge of his endurance, but his cabin had remained remarkably warm, even with the howling winds outside. Snow piled high against the walls, and the ground outside was a blanket of white and ice. Inside, the fire still burned strong, and Samuel could feel the heat radiating through the walls, almost as if the cabin itself had absorbed the warmth and was now holding it close. By the time the storm had passed, Samuel had grown more confident in his creation. The walls, thick with ash mud, had stood strong. The door, reinforced with iron brackets and sealed tightly, had held firm against the fierce wind. Even the small window, which Samuel had taken extra care to secure with a canvas cover and resin seal, had remained intact. But it wasn't just the structure that impressed Samuel. It was the way the cabin felt. He had been inside during storms before, but this was different. The air inside didn't feel damp and heavy as it usually did. It didn't feel like the cabin was fighting the cold. Instead, it felt like the cabin was a part of the mountain itself, grounded, solid, and unyielding to the whims of nature. The warmth was even and constant, and Samuel no longer felt the sharp bite of the cold. His experiment had worked. The revelation hit him like a thunderclap. He had found something revolutionary, something that could change the way men lived in the mountains, the way they built their homes, and the way they could survive. His technique wasn't just a way to survive the cold, it was a way to conquer it. The ashmud wall was not just insulation, it was a defensive mechanism. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about creating a barrier that no bear or mountain wind could penetrate. Samuel's mind raced as he thought about the other trappers scattered throughout the region. He had seen the way their cabins had been destroyed by bears, the way their homes were torn apart by storms. The thought of other men suffering through the same hardships made his blood boil with a sense of urgency. He knew that if he shared his discovery, it could save lives. It wasn't just about his survival anymore. It was about making sure that other men didn't suffer the same fate he had nearly faced. But how could he share this? How could he convince others to adopt a new way of building when the old ways had worked for so long? Samuel was no scholar, no great inventor, and he knew that change didn't come easy, especially not in the isolated, proud communities of the frontier. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of his discovery. His heart ached with the knowledge that others might still be out there, struggling to survive in cabins that were no better than the one he had started with. Samuel made a decision. The next spring, when the storm clouds cleared and the snow melted, he would leave his cabin behind and spread the word. He would share his methods, his discoveries, and his insight. If it meant saving lives, he would do whatever it took. His work wasn't finished, but the foundation was laid. Samuel Burke's cabin would stand as a testament to ingenuity, and his legacy would live on in the cabins of men who had never known his name. Spring came slowly to the Rockies, the snow hanging on in stubborn drifts that clung to the higher ridges, refusing to let go of the land. Samuel, restless after months of testing his new cabin, knew that it was time to leave. The harshest part of winter was over, but he wasn't interested in waiting for another storm to test the walls. He had seen enough. The fire had burned steady, the warmth within the cabin had held strong, and now it was time to share what he had learned. The first step was to visit the nearest trapper's cabin, a day's ride to the north. The journey was rough, as it always was when traveling the rugged trails of the Rockies. Samuel had saddled his horse early, wrapping himself in his furs and keeping his head low against the wind. His mind wasn't on the terrain, though. It was filled with thoughts of how to explain his method. Trappers, by their nature, were proud men. They didn't take kindly to outsiders telling them how to build their homes. Samuel knew this. But his creation had worked, and if he was going to make a difference, he needed to convince others. By midday, Samuel arrived at the cabin of a man named Amos, a trapper he'd known for years. Amos was rough around the edges, with a weathered face and a reputation for being stubborn. Samuel had heard tales of how his cabin had been damaged by a bear attack the previous winter, something he didn't need to witness firsthand to know how dangerous it could be. Amos's place was typical, a simple log structure with a sagging roof, a creaky door, and a window covered with old, tattered rawhide. Samuel knocked hard on the door, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. Amos answered with a gruff greeting, eyeing Samuel with curiosity. After the usual pleasantries, Samuel wasted no time. "I've made something that might help," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "A new way to build a cabin, something that can hold against bears, the wind, and the cold." Amos raised an eyebrow. "Ain't nothing wrong with my cabin. Got through 2 winters just fine." Samuel shook his head. "Not like this, not when the storm hits. I've seen it. Your door's weak. The corners are where they'll attack. This," he pointed to the rough stonework of his own cabin, "this'll stop it. I've seen it work." Amos stepped back, taking a long look at Samuel, sizing him up. The 2 men had shared campfires and traps in the past, but this was different. Samuel wasn't here to trade furs or share a hunting story. He was here to change the way things were done. After a long pause, Amos nodded. "Well, show me then," he muttered, his skepticism still clear in his voice. Samuel stepped inside the cabin, the familiar smell of wood smoke and leather filling the air. He ran his hand along the logs, showing Amos the weak points where animals could easily breach. He didn't have to explain much. The evidence was there for anyone with the eyes to see. But Samuel's eyes were alight with passion as he began to explain the ash-mud wall, the layers of clay and horsehair that held in warmth and repelled the cold. Amos listened in silence, his arms folded across his chest. Hours passed as Samuel laid out his process, demonstrating the benefits of reinforced corners and how to properly seal the gaps between logs. Amos was quiet, but Samuel could feel the man's mind turning, weighing the possibilities. Finally, Amos spoke. "All right, I'll give it a try. Can't hurt to see for myself." A sense of relief washed over Samuel. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a start. He had planted the seed, and though he knew that not every trapper would immediately adopt his ideas, he also knew that Amos was no fool. If it worked for him, it would work for others. Samuel left that evening with a small sense of triumph, but also with the knowledge that there was much more to be done. The seed had been planted, and now it was time to see if it would grow. As the summer months passed, word began to spread. Samuel had spent the early part of the season traveling from one trapper's camp to another, sharing his innovation with anyone who would listen. Some dismissed him outright, scoffing at the idea that a simple cabin could be anything more than a shelter. Others, like Amos, were more open, agreeing to try the new methods, even if only out of curiosity. Samuel knew it wouldn't be easy to convince everyone, but the ones who listened gave him hope. By mid-July, Samuel had made a breakthrough. He'd found a group of trappers who had recently lost their cabins to a series of grizzly bear attacks. The men were desperate, tired of rebuilding every season. Their losses had been significant, and the frustration of living in constant fear had left them eager for a solution. Samuel saw this as his chance. He arrived at their camp one morning, his horse loaded with supplies, nails, iron brackets, canvas, and the other materials that had become essential to his new method of cabin construction. He was greeted with wary eyes, but also with the kind of cautious hope that comes from men who had nowhere else to turn. Samuel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He started immediately, explaining the value of a strong foundation, how the careful placement of logs could eliminate weak points, and the revolutionary idea of using a mixture of clay, ash, and horsehair for chinking. The men listened intently, their skepticism slowly giving way to understanding. Over the next few weeks, Samuel worked side by side with them, helping them build a new cabin. The process was slow, each step carefully executed, but the results spoke for themselves. The logs were fitted with precision, and the ash-mud mixture was applied in thick layers, sealing the gaps and ensuring the cabin would be impenetrable to the mountain's fierce elements. By the time the cabin was finished, it was clear that Samuel had created something remarkable. The walls stood firm, the door solid, and the roof, reinforced with layers of birch bark and clay, was as impenetrable as any fortress. The men, once doubtful, now looked at Samuel with admiration. They had no doubt that this cabin would stand the test of time and, more importantly, stand strong against the bears that had ravaged their previous homes. As the work finished, one of the men turned to Samuel, a grin on his face. "You've done it, Burke. This cabin'll last us." Samuel smiled, but he knew the real test was yet to come. This cabin, though a victory, was just the beginning. More men needed to hear this message, and more cabins needed to be built. But for now, it was enough. The seed had been planted, and Samuel's innovation was spreading like wildfire. The mountain men, once proud and solitary, were starting to come together, each one learning from the other, working to survive, to build a better life in the harsh wilderness. As Samuel left the camp, his heart was light. The work had been hard, but the payoff was clear. He had done what he set out to do, create a shelter strong enough to face whatever the wild could throw at it. And now he could see that it wasn't just his future that was changing. It was the future of every man who called the mountains home. The months passed, and Samuel's reputation began to spread beyond the small circle of trappers he had worked with directly. He didn't seek fame or recognition. His only desire was for others to learn from his discovery. But in the isolated world of the frontier, word travels slowly, and Samuel knew that convincing the majority of mountain men to adopt his techniques wouldn't be easy. Even so, he remained hopeful. It wasn't until the first significant test of the cabins that Samuel's work truly gained traction. A particularly harsh winter storm, one of the worst in recent memory, descended upon the Rockies with brutal speed. The winds howled through the trees, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that men across the region had little time to prepare for its full force. In the days that followed, the trappers began to return to their cabins, battered by the storm, but determined to check on their homes. The difference was immediately clear. The men who had followed Samuel's teachings, those who had built their cabins with the reinforced corners, ash-mud walls, and durable roofs, found their shelters intact and warm. Their fires burned bright inside, and while the winds outside still howled, they were shielded from the worst of the cold. But the others, those who hadn't adopted the new techniques, were not so lucky. Several cabins had collapsed or been severely damaged by the storm. Others had been torn apart by the relentless winds and snow, their occupants barely able to make it through. Samuel received word of the storm's aftermath from Amos, who reported that the cabin Samuel had helped build had withstood the storm perfectly. The once skeptical trapper couldn't hide his surprise and respect. "I'll be damned," Amos said, shaking his head. "It worked better than I could have imagined. We were warm the whole time, not a single crack in the wall." "You weren't lying, Burke. I'll tell you that much." For the first time, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't much. He hadn't built the cabin to prove anyone wrong, but the success of his method couldn't be denied now. His invention had passed the ultimate test. But even then, Samuel knew this success would not be enough to convince every trapper. He had seen enough pride and stubbornness in the men he'd worked with to know that some would resist. To truly make a difference, Samuel would have to find a way to prove that his methods weren't just practical, they were essential for survival. He spent the next few weeks visiting the camps of men whose cabins had been damaged by the storm. Many were reluctant to accept help. their pride a heavy burden. Samuel offered advice without pushing. He showed them how they could rebuild their cabins using the same techniques that had worked for Amos and others. Slowly, the first few began to see the wisdom in his approach. They started to realize that the world of the mountains wasn't a place where you could afford to be stubborn. In this unforgiving environment, survival meant adapting, changing, and learning from those who had figured out a better way. Samuel didn't change their minds overnight, but by the end of the winter, he could see the tides shifting. Men who had once scoffed at his methods now looked at their damaged cabins and saw only the need for improvement. The idea that a mountain man could not only survive, but thrive in the harshest conditions by using ingenuity and collaboration rather than stubbornness began to take root. By the time the thaw came in the spring, Samuel had seen his method spread to dozens of cabins throughout the region. His work wasn't over, but it had gained the traction he needed. Word had spread far enough to reach the ears of others, settlers, hunters, and even those in nearby towns who had heard rumors of a man building cabins that could withstand even the fiercest storms and the deadliest predators. Samuel had gone from a lone trapper with an obsession to a symbol of practical ingenuity on the frontier. As the seasons turned, Samuel found himself at the heart of a new community of builders. Some were trappers like him, others were settlers who had come west seeking their fortune. Together, they shared knowledge, materials, and labor. They no longer built just for survival. They built to thrive. The cabins, now known by all as Bridger style, were stronger, warmer, and safer than any structure the Rockies had seen before. But Samuel's legacy was more than just the cabins themselves. It was in the way people worked together, the way they embraced change for the sake of survival. The frontier had always been a place of rugged individualism, but Samuel's influence began to shift that mindset, if only slightly. He had shown that the key to thriving in the wilderness wasn't just about outlasting the elements, but about using your brain, your creativity, and your willingness to listen to others. One afternoon, while he was helping a young settler build a cabin near the banks of a stream, Samuel paused for a moment to take in the scene around him. The new cabin, built with the same care and precision that he had used all those months ago, stood tall against the backdrop of towering trees and sweeping mountains. The walls, coated with the same ash-mud mixture he had first created, were already beginning to warm from the heat of the fire inside. The work had been hard, but as the settler moved confidently, hammering nails into the framework, Samuel could see that the old ways based on survival and toughness alone, were slowly giving way to a more thoughtful, collaborative approach. The young man, wiping sweat from his brow, looked up at Samuel with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "You know, I've been thinking. I don't reckon this would have worked without you. It's not just the cabins, it's the way you think about things. How'd you figure all this out anyway?" Samuel smiled, his eyes softening. "Sometimes you don't figure it out. Sometimes you just can't accept things the way they are. You see what's wrong, and you fix it, no matter how long it takes." The young man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'd say you've fixed more than a few things, Burke." Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he looked out over the valley, the sun beginning to dip behind the mountains. There was still much to do, many more cabins to build, and many more lives to touch. But for the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel the weight of the mountains pressing down on him. Instead, he felt a sense of peace, his legacy, not just in the cabins, but in the men and women who had embraced a new way of life in the wilderness. In time, Samuel's innovation spread far beyond the Rocky Mountains. Though he never sought recognition, his cabin stood as a testament to his ingenuity and to the strength of a community that chose survival, not through brute strength, but through thoughtful, shared wisdom. And as the years passed, long after Samuel had moved on to a quieter life, the cabins he had helped build continued to stand firm, offering shelter to generations of frontier men and women. In the wilderness of the American frontier, Samuel Burke had not only found a way to survive, he had shown others how to live. Years passed, and Samuel's work had become the foundation for a new way of living in the Rockies. Though many knew the name Bridger style for the cabins that had withstood the wildest storms, few knew the man who had created them. Samuel had moved on to a quieter life, away from the rugged frontier, trading his life as a trapper for the steadiness of ranching. Yet, even as he tended his new land, the legacy of his work continued to ripple across the mountains. One afternoon, as he worked with his horses, a familiar figure approached his homestead. It was Amos, the trapper who had once doubted his methods, now a believer in the value of what Samuel had built. "Samuel," Amos called out, tipping his hat, "I'm here to tell you, your cabins, they're still standing. Some of them are almost 40 years old, and they're holding up better than any others. You made something that lasted, more than just buildings. Your ideas, they're still helping." Samuel smiled, his weathered face softening. "I never wanted glory, just survival." And as Amos left, Samuel stood by his cabin, watching the sunset, knowing that his work had made a difference. Samuel's years as a trapper were behind him, but the lessons he'd learned never left. He had seen the wild as unforgiving, yet he had found a way to endure, to adapt, and to share that knowledge. By the time he passed, his cabins had become more than just shelters. They were symbols of resilience, proof that ingenuity could conquer even the harshest environments. Though Samuel left behind no grand monument or written history, the cabins stood tall in the Rockies, timeless in their strength. His work lived on, not in the pages of books, but in the very foundations of the frontier. And as the years wore on, those who lived in his cabins carried on his spirit of resourcefulness and collaboration, ensuring that Samuel's legacy, built brick by brick, log by log, would endure for generations.